Alright, let's settle in, friends. Tonight, we're diving deep into the world of medieval marriage. And I mean deep. We're not talking fairy tales and happily ever afters. Oh no. We're talking about the nitty-gritty, the real-life struggles, and the often messy realities of what happened when those medieval vows, well, didn't exactly work out. Now, before we get into the juicy bits, the betrayals, the desertions, the downright bizarre annulment cases, we need to set the stage. Think of this as your medieval marriage 101 course. Forget everything you've seen in Disney movies or romantic comedies, because this is going to be a whole different ball game. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine a world vastly different from our own, a world where your life's trajectory was often decided before you could even walk, let alone choose your own socks. A world governed by powerful institutions, the church and the aristocracy, who had very specific ideas about what marriage should be. We're talking about a society structured around land ownership, lineage, and let's be honest, good old-fashioned power. Marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't primarily about love, at least not the way we typically think about it today. Sure, affection and companionship could develop, and in some cases undoubtedly did, but the primary function of marriage was far more pragmatic, securing alliances, consolidating wealth, producing legitimate heirs and maintaining social order. It was a business deal, a political maneuver, and a social obligation all rolled into one, and sometimes love blossomed despite that, not because of it. Think of it like this. Marriages in the medieval world were often strategic mergers, the joining of two families, two estates, two bloodlines. It was a way to ensure that the family name and the family fortune continued to thrive. You might be thinking, wow, sounds a little loveless. And sometimes, yeah, it was. But that doesn't mean everyone was miserable all the time. People found ways to navigate these arrangements, to find happiness and connection within the confines of societal expectations. Now, who got married? Well, pretty much everyone. Marriage was the expected, and frankly, the required state for most people. Celibacy was really only for those entering religious life, like priests and nuns. For everyone else, getting hitched was just what you did, and the pressures to conform were enormous. Society frowned upon those who remained single, especially women. Single women were seen as a threat, a loose end, a potential burden on the community. Married women, on the other hand, were considered to be contributing members of society, wives, mothers, and managers of the household. But what defined a marriage back then? What made it legit? Well, that's where the church comes in. The church, as the dominant moral and spiritual authority, played a huge role in defining marriage and its purpose. We're going to talk a lot more about that in the next section, but spoiler alert, the church believed that marriage was a sacrament, a sacred bond ordained by God, and crucially, that it was meant to be indissoluble. What God has joined together, let no man or woman put asunder, right? Yeah, that was the theory. But reality, as you can imagine, was far more complicated. Because what happens when two people who are essentially forced together, who have different expectations, different desires, and maybe just plain don't like each other? Well, what happens when they want out? That, my friends, is where things get interesting. And that's what we're going to explore in this series. What happened when those carefully laid plans went sideways? How did people navigate the rigid rules and expectations of medieval marriage when things fell apart? What were the legal options, if any? What were the social consequences? We'll be looking at royal marriages, where the stakes were incredibly high, and the fate of kingdoms often hung in the balance. We'll explore noble unions, where land and power were the ultimate prizes. We'll even delve into the lives of merchants and peasants, where marriage was often a crucial economic partnership. No matter the social class, everyone faced their own set of struggles and challenges within the institution of marriage. So, buckle up, because this is going to be a fascinating and sometimes unsettling journey into the heart of medieval life. It's a world of arranged marriages, dowries and bride wealth, of marital expectations, gender dynamics, and yes, a whole lot of infidelity, but also a world where people try to build lives, find love, and make the best of the circumstances they were born into. It wasn't always pretty, but it was always real. And understanding the realities of medieval marriage is key to understanding the social, political, and economic fabric of the time. Now, before we move on, I want you to picture yourself back then. Think about the pressures you would face, the limited choices you would have, the expectations you would have to meet. How would you navigate the complexities of medieval marriage? And what would you do if things started to unravel? That's the question we'll be exploring together. Let's go. Alright, let's settle in and get cozy, because we're about to dive into some serious church business, medieval style. And when I say serious, I mean serious. We're talking about the foundation of marriage as they saw it, and trust me, they didn't mess around. So the medieval church, particularly the Catholic Church, wasn't just a building or a weekly service, right? It was the backbone of pretty much everything. Like, your entire life, from birth to death, was intricately woven with church doctrine. And marriage? Oh, that was right up there with the most sacred things. Now, when we talk about what the church thought about marriage, it's essential to realize that this wasn't just some nice suggestion, it was the LA Dullo, canon law, to be precise. And it shaped not only religious views but also legal and social expectations for centuries. Okay, so what was the church's definition of marriage then? Well, primarily it was a sacrament, a holy union ordained by God. This meant that marriage wasn't just some contract, some kind of business deal. This was about a sacred bond between a man and a woman, blessed by God. Key point here, this union, according to the church, was intended for life. It wasn't just about procreation, even though, let's be real, having kids was considered a major part of the deal. The church emphasized that marriage was also about mutual support, companionship, and a way to channel human sexuality within a framework they considered morally acceptable. Basically, sex was for babies, and marriage was the only okay place to have it. I know, wild, right? But what really set the church's stance apart was this concept of indissolubility. I know, it's a big word, but it is what it sounds like. This meant marriage was meant to last forever, like, until death do us part, no take-backs forever. The idea was rooted in biblical passages, like the ones where Jesus talks about marriage being a bond that humans shouldn't break, a bond created by God. So, once you were married, end of story. Well, not quite, as we'll see later on, because life, as always, finds a way to get complicated. But in theory, that was the ideal. And this wasn't just some vague idea tossed around at Sunday Mass. The church actually developed a whole complex legal framework around it. We're talking about regulations, courts, judges, and a whole system dedicated to ensuring that marriages once entered into were upheld. The church courts, known as ecclesiastical courts, had jurisdiction over all things marriage-related. So, if there were disputes, questions about validity, or accusations of wrongdoing, that's where you'd go. And believe me, these courts were busy, super busy. But why, you might ask? did the church insist so heavily on this indissolubility thing? What was the point? Several reasons really. One, and this is important, was about upholding the sanctity of the sacrament. If marriage was holy, ordained by God, then breaking it was basically like spitting in God's face, right? So maintaining its permanence was essential for upholding religious principles. Then, there was the stability angle. The church believed that strong, stable marriages were the foundation of a stable society. If people could just hop in and out of marriages whenever they felt like it, well, that would lead to all sorts of chaos. Think about inheritance, property rights, the legitimacy of children, all that stuff would be up in the air. So to keep things nice and orderly, marriage needed to be rock solid. And of course there was the protection of women, seriously. Now I know it sounds weird considering all the other power dynamics at play, but the church argued that indissolubility actually protected women from being easily discarded by their husbands. If a man knew he couldn't just dump his wife whenever he got bored or found someone else, he might be more inclined to treat her better, right? Or so they thought. Of course there were loopholes, but that's a can of worms for later. The official position was for women's safety, but, well, let's just get to that later. So, in essence, the church's perspective on marriage was all about creating a sacred, permanent and stable union designed to serve God, society, and ideally the individuals involved. But remember, this was the ideal. Now you might be thinking, okay, but what if things went wrong? What if people were just miserable? Did the church just shrug and say, tough luck, you made your bed, now lie in it? Well, that's where things get interesting, and a bit hypocritical. Because while divorce, as we think of it today, was a big no-no, there were, shall we say, options for getting out of a marriage. The main option was the annulment. We'll get into annulments later, as well as other ways marriages failed, despite this indissolubility thing. But for now, let's just say that while the church preached the whole forever thing, the reality on the ground was often much messier, much more complicated, and sometimes a whole lot more scandalous. So, that's the church's perspective in a nutshell. Pretty strict, pretty unwavering, and pretty influential in shaping the entire landscape of medieval marriage. Remember, this wasn't just some abstract theological concept. It was the framework that governed people's lives, their relationships, and their place in society. But as we'll see, even with the weight of the church behind it, marriage in the Middle Ages was far from a simple, straightforward affair. There were politics, power, money, and all the messy realities of human life constantly pushing against this ideal of indissolubility. And that's where the real stories begin. Yawn. Okay. Next up is royal marriages. Try to stay awake. Alright, let's dive into the world of royal marriages, those high-stakes, tiara-laden unions that shaped the course of history. Forget romance novels, folks. These weren't about finding the one, they were about securing power, forging alliances, and ensuring the family business, the kingdom, kept on ticking. So picture this, you're a medieval monarch, right? Your kingdom's surrounded by potential rivals, everyone's eyeing your territory, and treaties are about as reliable as a weather forecast. What do? You marry off your kids. It's like a medieval version of a corporate merger, only with more velvet and fewer spreadsheets. Royal marriages were, at their core, political transactions. Pure and simple. Think of it this way. Kingdoms were like family businesses, and marriage was the deal that secured the next generation. These marriages were carefully orchestrated, planned years in advance, and involved a lot of negotiations. We're talking about discussions over dowries, land rights, military support, and even what titles future kids would hold. This wasn't a love match kind of thing. It was a business transaction, a peace treaty sealed in blood, and marital relations. Dynastic concerns were huge. It wasn't just about expanding territory, it was about ensuring the royal bloodline continued. A king needed a legitimate heir, and preferably a spare or two, just in case. A barren queen was a disaster. That could lead to messy succession crises, civil wars, and all sorts of unpleasantness. Think Game of Thrones, but with slightly less gratuitous violence maybe. And let's be real, everyone was related, right? I mean, royal families were intermarrying like crazy across Europe. It was a tangled web of cousins marrying cousins, all in the name of keeping the power within a select few families. This actually led to some interesting genetic consequences over time, but that's a story for another time. Now, these political considerations also played out on the world stage. England and France, for instance, were constantly marrying their royals into other European houses to gain allies and to isolate their enemies. These marriages could be pivotal in determining who sided with whom in major conflicts. If your daughter married the King of Spain, you suddenly had a powerful friend on your side in any beef with France. Conversely, if you snubbed a potential marriage alliance, you could make a powerful enemy. But it wasn't always smooth sailing, of course. Sometimes, even the best laid plans went awry. A marriage designed to cement peace could crumble if one kingdom broke the treaty, or if the royal couple just couldn't stand each other, which, given the lack of choice involved, happened more often than you'd think. And when a marriage failed, the consequences could be devastating. Alliances could collapse, wars could break out, and the royal family could find itself in a seriously sticky situation. Take the example of Eleanor of Aquitaine. This woman was a powerhouse. First, she was Queen of France by marrying Louis VII, but that marriage was annulled because they didn't produce a male heir. No problem. She then married Henry II of England, making her Queen of England and bringing a huge chunk of France under English control. So yeah, you can say politics was involved. Another good example is Henry VIII. Good old Henry went through 6 wives in his quest for a male heir. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon was initially a great political alliance with Spain, but when Catherine couldn't produce a son, Henry decided to break with the Catholic Church, start his own religion, and marry Anne Boleyn. So a minor detail. These marriages weren't about love, they were about power, legacy, and let's not forget that ever-elusive male heir. These royal marriages weren't just some fairy tale. They were the glue that held kingdoms together, the threads that wove the tapestry of medieval politics. Each union carried the weight of expectation, the hopes of a kingdom, and sometimes the seeds of future conflict. So the next time you see a royal wedding, remember there's a whole lot more going on than just a pretty dress and a cape. Okay, let's talk noble marriages, right? Not exactly the fairy tale stuff, though sometimes maybe they lucked out, but mostly land, power, and keeping the family name up there in the social stratosphere. Think of it like this. Medieval nobility was all about real estate and influence.
Marriage?
A business deal with vows. Sweet, huh? Not really. It was a way to consolidate holdings, create alliances, and make sure your kids inherited even more than you did. Like a giant game of medieval Monopoly. So who you married really mattered. It wasn't just about some cute knight catching your eye. More like, did this countess have a killer dowry? Did that duke control a strategic port? Did marrying that family stop them from waging war on your family? Super important stuff. Land was seriously the big one. Marrying an heiress could bring a whole region under your family's control. Think of it like unlocking a new level in the game. Suddenly, you have more resources, more people to tax, and just generally, a bigger sandbox to play in. It's all about the land, but it wasn't just land, it was also about titles. A king marrying a princess from another kingdom. Boom. Potential claim to the throne down the line. A duke marrying a countess. Bam. Instant upgrade in status for your kids. Gotta climb that social ladder. Family status was everything, honestly. Marrying down. Oh, the shame. It could weaken your bloodline, bring in undesirable relatives, and damage your family's reputation for generations. So nobles usually stuck to marrying other nobles. Kept things nice and tidy in the upper crust, Power, of course, plays a massive role too. Noble families were constantly jockeying for position at court, trying to get the king's ear, grabbing those sweet government jobs. Marriage was a way to buy friends or neutralize enemies. Say you're at odds with another powerful family. Instead of endless fighting, you could marry your son to their daughter. Suddenly, you're related. Awkward family gatherings are a way better option than open warfare, right? So a lot of these marriages happened simply to create some stability in the region or to avoid conflicts. And speaking of conflicts, we have to consider who arranged these unions. It wasn't the cute couple. The parents did, maybe a trusted advisor or a family friend who was a whiz at medieval matchmaking. The kids rarely had a say, maybe a polite yes father if they were lucky. These arrangements were planned years in advance. Kids could be betrothed as toddlers. Seriously. Imagine being promised to someone you've never met before you even lose all your baby teeth. The joys of nobility. What about love? Sigh. Sometimes it happened. Maybe the couple actually liked each other. But let's be real. Love was a bonus, not a requirement. Compatibility was more important. Could this person run a household, produce heirs, not embarrass the family? Those were the important qualifications. And the pressure to produce heirs, oh man, it was intense, especially male heirs. If a noble woman couldn't give her husband a son, well, she was basically a failure, and that could lead to some unpleasant consequences, like being replaced with a younger, more fertile model. Not fun. So you have unhappy unions. When that happened, what was it like? Well, there would be mistresses. Illegitimate children were common, especially among the nobility. They weren't exactly celebrated, but everyone knew they existed. You also might find couples living separate lives in the same castle, just putting on a show for the public. Or maybe there's open warfare going on between the couple, each trying to undermine the other. It could get really ugly really fast. And what if the marriage completely failed? What if the wife couldn't produce an heir? Or there was adultery involved? Or the couple just straight up hated each other? Could they get divorced? Not exactly. Divorce as we know it wasn't really a thing for nobles. The church was pretty strict about marriage being for life. But there was a loophole, annulment. If you could prove the marriage wasn't valid in the first place, the church could annul it. But how do you prove a marriage wasn't valid? Okay, so you could claim you were forced into it, or that you were too closely related to your spouse, or that, gasp, the marriage was never consummated. Basically any excuse you could think of to get out of it. But annulments were tricky and expensive. You needed to have serious influence at the church, and even then there were no guarantees. Kings might find ways around it, of course. With enough pressure, even the Pope could see the light. But for most nobles, it was a long shot. Noble marriages, they were definitely not simple. They were complex, political, and often pretty cold. They were about land, power, family status, not always about love. Sometimes it worked out, sometimes it was a total disaster. But either way, they were one of the key building blocks of medieval society. These marriages shaped borders and the very course of history, so it makes them all the more fascinating to look back on. Alright, settling in for a bit of a different topic today, folks. We're diving into the world of medieval merchant marriages. Think less Romeo and Juliet and more strategic mergers and acquisitions. Yeah, medieval times weren't all knights and dragons. They were also about making money, and marriage was a surprisingly useful tool in that pursuit. So imagine you're a successful merchant in, say, 14th century Florence or Bruges. You've got ships sailing, goods flowing, and money jingling. Life is good, but it could be better. You need to secure your business, expand your network, and maybe even climb a rung or two on the social ladder. That's where marriage comes in. For merchants, marriage wasn't really about finding that perfect soulmate or some grand romance. Sure, maybe some affection developed along the way, but primarily it was a business arrangement, a practical, calculated move to solidify their position in the cutthroat cutthroat world of medieval commerce. Think of it like a modern-day business partnership, but with vows and maybe a few more relatives getting involved. Marrying someone from another merchant family meant instantly gaining access to their resources, their trade routes, their contacts. Need to get your silks into a new market across the Mediterranean? Marry a merchant's daughter from Venice, who already has established roots there. Suddenly doors open that were previously slammed shut. These marriages could create veritable trade empires, linking families across vast distances. A merchant in London might marry off his daughter to a cloth merchant in Flanders. Now suddenly, English wool is flowing freely into the Flemish textile industry, and Flemish finished cloth is making its way into English markets with preferential treatment. Everyone wins, well, almost everyone, and it wasn't just about expanding existing businesses, it was about securing them too. Medieval commerce was a risky game. Ships sank, goods spoiled, pirates raided. Marrying into another wealthy family provided a safety net. If one business venture went south, the combined family wealth could cushion the blow. It was like medieval insurance, but with in-laws. Plus, these marriages helped maintain family control over their business ventures. Keeping wealth and expertise within the family was super important. It wasn't like you could just hire a qualified CEO from LinkedIn. Your kids were your succession plan, and their marriages were part of securing that plan. But here's where it gets interesting. Social mobility. The medieval society was pretty rigid, right? You were born into a certain class, and you usually stayed there, but money could change things. Successful merchants flush with cash started eyeing the lower ranks of the nobility, and some nobles, constantly strapped for cash, started eyeing the merchant's deep pockets. Enter the merchant marriage as a social climbing tool. A wealthy merchant might marry his daughter to an impoverished noble. The noble gets a much-needed injection of cash to prop up his estate, and the merchant's family gets a fancy title and a boost in social standing. It was a win-win, kind of. Of course, these arrangements weren't always smooth sailing. The nobility often looked down on the merchant class, seeing them as, well, commoners, and the merchants often viewed the nobility as lazy and entitled. There could be a lot of tension within these newly merged families. Imagine the Thanksgiving dinners, and the women involved in these marriages. They weren't just passive pawns, they often played a crucial role in the family business. Many were educated, intelligent, and actively involved in managing accounts, overseeing trade, and even representing the family in business negotiations. Think of them as the unsung CEOs of their time. When a merchant was away on business or fell ill, his wife would step in to manage the operations. She could hire and fire employees, make financial decisions, and even defend the business in court. These women weren't just decorative wives, they were integral to the success of the family enterprise. Of course, the success of these marriages depended on a lot of factors. Compatibility, mutual respect, and a shared understanding of the business were all key. But let's be real, money and social advancement were usually the primary motivators. And what happened when these merchant marriages failed? Well, that's where things get complicated. Divorce was pretty much off the table thanks to the church, but separation, sometimes, annulments. If you had enough money and influence and a really good lawyer, maybe. But a failed merchant marriage could have serious consequences. It could lead to business rivalries, family feuds, and even financial ruin. Imagine a messy divorce today, but amplified by medieval social and legal constraints. Not pretty. So next time you're thinking about medieval times, remember it wasn't all just castles and knights. It was also about merchants wheeling and dealing, using marriage as a strategic tool to build empires, climb the social ladder, and secure their family's future. And it reminds us that even in the most seemingly romantic institutions, like marriage, business, and power, always find a way to creep in, doesn't it? Kind of makes you appreciate modern dating apps, doesn't it? Maybe a little. Anyway, sleep tight. Alright, settle in, because we're diving into the nitty-gritty of peasant weddings, and trust me, it's a world away from royal courtships. We're talking community, custom, and cold, hard economics. So you're a peasant, life's tough, and marriage, Well, it's not exactly a romantic fairy tale. It's more like a crucial strategic alliance between two families struggling to survive. But don't think that means there isn't any fun to be had. These weddings were a huge deal for the community, a rare chance to let loose and celebrate, even if just for a little while. First things first, finding a partner. Forget dating apps. We're talking matchmaking, medieval style. Parents, elders, or even a designated matchmaker in the village would usually play a pretty significant role. Think of it as a communal decision. They were focused on finding someone suitable, strong, healthy, and from a family with a good reputation. Love, well, it was considered a bonus, not a necessity. And look, in our modern eyes, the whole thing sounds a little calculated. But in a world where survival was a daily struggle, practicality always had to come first. Now, before you start picturing champagne toasts and diamond rings, let's talk about the economic side of things. For peasants, marriage was all about the practical. A lot of times it was about sharing the workload and making sure there were enough hands to work the land. No one had any wedding funds, so a lot of it was about finding a way to do it that did not put either family in debt. This is where things get interesting and varied, because across medieval Europe, wedding customs differed wildly from region to region, even village to village. But the underlying economic themes were pretty consistent. For example, the concept of a dowry. You're probably familiar with it, because it's sort of everywhere, but you might think of it as a payment made by the bride's family to the groom's family. This wasn't always cash, of course. More often, it was land, livestock, tools, or household goods that the bride would bring into the marriage. It basically represented her share of the family's wealth, and also served as a sort of safety net in case her husband died. And then there's something called bride wealth. This is where the groom or his family gave something of value to the bride or her family. This could be anything from a promise of future support to a payment in goods or services. This was less common than dowries, but it still played a role in some regions. Now, arranging all of that was a big deal. Negotiations could be intense, and they were often conducted with multiple village elders present. There might have been haggling over every sheep and every plot of land. Remember, this wasn't just about the two individuals getting married, it was about securing the future of two families. So the day arrives, and let's talk about the peasant wedding celebration itself. Forget lavish banquets. These were down-to-earth, community-focused affairs. More often than not, the wedding would take place on a day that didn't require a lot of working, Sunday for example. In the local church, if one was available and the families had enough money for it. But some of these marriages would just happen at the door, with the priest signing off on it after the fact. It's a far cry from the ornate cathedrals that the nobility would get married at. The actual ceremony, led by the village priest, would be relatively short and sweet. The church's involvement in peasant weddings was pretty variable, with it being a lot more important to have the families to recognize the marriage. The focus was usually on the vows and the blessing of the union. Once the vows were said and sealed, the party would begin. This is where the whole village came together to celebrate. There'd be music, think pipes, drums, and whatever instruments the villagers could cobble together, dancing, and a lot of food and drink. And I do mean a lot. Feasting was a central part of the celebration, and the food would be provided by contributions from everyone in the village. Maybe one family would donate a pig, another would bring bread, and so on. It was a community effort to feed the wedding guests. Dancing played a huge role in peasant celebrations. These weren't elegant balls, mind you. We're talking folk dances, group dances, where everyone could join in. This was a chance to release some stress and have some much-needed fun. And of course, there would have been alcohol. Beer, cider, or whatever local brew was available. It's safe to say that the booze flowed pretty freely. it would be a lot of people's only way to just relax. Peasant wedding celebrations weren't always all sweetness and light. There was always the possibility of rivalries between families erupting and things getting a little roady. But for the most part, these were joyful occasions, a chance for the community to come together and celebrate new beginnings. Beyond just that though, these marriages were also cementing social bonds. These events were also strengthening ties between families and clans. It helped ensure cooperation and mutual support within the village. And now that the honeymoon is over, what's it really like to be in a peasant marriage? Well, it wasn't always a bed of roses. Life was hard, and marriage brought its own set of challenges. Poverty, disease, and back-breaking work were constant realities. Domestic violence was also unfortunately common, and there were limited avenues for recourse. And also remember, divorce was basically out of the question for the peasants because the church forbid it. So couples were stuck with each other and worked it out or not. And while that isn't exactly an ideal picture, that meant something to these people. They knew what they were getting into. Alright, let's dive into the world of arranged marriages in the medieval era, focusing on the role that families and of course those sometimes sneaky, sometimes helpful, always interesting matchmakers played. Now before you drift off completely, this isn't your modern rom-com version, okay? Think less witty banter, more strategic alliances whispered about in drafty castles. So picture this, you're a noble, maybe you're a merchant. Heck, maybe even a well-off peasant farmer. Romance as we know it isn't really at the forefront of your mind when it comes to choosing a spouse for your child. What is important? Well, it's the family name, the land holdings, the potential for a better harvest, or the opening up of that juicy new trade route. Marriage, in this context, was less about love and more about, well, everything else. It was a business deal, a political chess move, a way to ensure the survival and ideally the growth of your family's influence. That's where arranged marriages came in. It wasn't quite as draconian as some stories make out, at least, not always. Now, let me just preface that, because there were times when people had no say in things, so please keep in mind it wasn't the best of times for all involved. In many cases, it was a carefully negotiated agreement between two families. Parents, or even more often, the heads of the think stern uncles or formidable grandmothers, would sit down and discuss the merits of a potential match. Think of it as a medieval corporate merger, but with slightly more awkward family dinners. Okay, but how did they even find these potential matches? That's where our trusty matchmakers shuffle into the story. These were the unsung heroes, or maybe slightly shady characters depending on your perspective, of the medieval marriage market. Sometimes they were formal, professional agents traveling between courts and noble houses, armed with genealogies and inventories of land. Other times they were more informal, maybe a well-connected aunt, a gossipy neighbor, or even a clever priest who knew everyone's business. Their job was simple: to identify suitable candidates, assess their worth, and I mean worth in all senses of the word, and then facilitate the negotiations. They were the go-betweens, smoothing over disagreements, emphasizing the benefits of the union, and let's be honest, probably exaggerating a little here and there. The matchmaker's role was particularly crucial when families lived far apart or didn't have any existing connections. Think of it as the medieval version of online dating, but instead of swiping right, you're presenting a detailed family tree and a list of your daughter's dowry. Success for a matchmaker often meant prestige, rewards, and the satisfaction of solidifying social bonds. But failure? Well, let's just say angering powerful families wasn't great for your health. Now, what about the young people actually getting married? Did they have any say in the matter? This is where it gets a little complicated. Officially, the church emphasized the importance of consent. Canon law stated that a marriage wasn't valid unless both parties freely agreed to it. However, the reality often differed wildly from this ideal, especially among the upper classes. While outright forced marriages were frowned upon, at least in theory, there was often immense pressure put on young people to agree to a match that their families had arranged. Dissent could mean disinheritance, social ostracism, or even being packed off to a convent or monastery, which, trust me, wasn't always a pleasant alternative. This often led to a very subtle version of coercion being applied to them to take action. However, it wasn't always doom and gloom. Some arranged marriages actually worked out pretty well. Sometimes a mutual respect and affection grew between the couple over time. They learned to rely on each other, to appreciate each other's strengths, and to build a life together, even if it wasn't based on the whirlwind romance we see in movies. Plus, let's not forget that shared interests and social standing could be powerful bonding agents in their own right. And interestingly, even when families dictated the initial match, there were ways for young people to exert some influence. A clever woman could use her wit and charm to win over her husband's family, securing her position and gaining some control over her own life. A shrewd man could use his business acumen or military skills to impress his in-laws, proving that he was a valuable addition to the family. Ultimately, arranged marriages in the medieval era were a complex and multifaceted institution. They weren't always about love, but they were about survival, security, and the continuation of the family line. Families, matchmakers, the church, and the young people themselves all played a role in shaping these unions, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in conflict. So next time you're at a wedding, take a moment to think about all the different motivations that might have brought a couple together throughout history, and be grateful that at least in most parts of the world today, you get to choose your own happily ever after, or at least try to. Alright, now, time for a nap. Alright, so let's delve into the fascinating world of medieval marriage, and specifically those all-important economic transactions, dowries and bride wealth. Now, these weren't just side notes, they were central to the whole institution of marriage, really setting the stage for expectations and social standing. So settle in, maybe grab a warm blanket, and let's explore what happened when love met, well, money, or land, or livestock. You get the idea. First things first, let's just make sure we're all on the same page about what these terms actually mean. A dowry, generally speaking, was property, and I'm talking anything from cash money to clothing and furniture, and sometimes even land, that a woman's family provided to her husband upon marriage. Think of it like this: the bride is coming into a new household, a new family, and to help her establish her place, and let's be honest, compensate her new family for taking on the responsibility of supporting her, she came with assets. Bride wealth, on the other hand, was pretty much the reverse. It's property or goods given by the groom's family to the bride's family. It was most common in societies where women's labor was particularly valued. Basically, it was a payment to compensate the bride's family for the loss of her labor and contributions to their household. So, with us so far, dowry to the groom from the bride's family, bride wealth to the bride's family from the groom. Now, in medieval Europe, dowries were definitely the more prevalent system, especially amongst the nobility and the burgeoning merchant classes. Bride wealth hung around mostly in the earlier parts of the medieval period, and mostly at the peasant level. But let's be clear, dowries were a big deal. A woman's status, her attractiveness as a marriage prospect, even her future security within that marriage, were often directly tied to the size and nature of her dowry. Think about it this way: for a noble family, marrying off a daughter wasn't just about finding her happiness, although hopefully that figured in there somewhere. It was about forging alliances, securing land, and improving the family's overall standing. A substantial dowry could grease the wheels of those negotiations, making a daughter a far more appealing candidate for a strategic marriage. It's all very Game of Thrones, isn't it? Without the dragons, usually. The contents of a dowry varied according to social class. For a peasant girl, it might include essential household items, a sturdy chest for storing clothes, bedding, maybe a cow or some sheep if her family was doing okay. For a merchant's daughter, the dowry could consist of cash, valuable textiles like linens and silks, jewelry, or even a share in the family business. And for a noble woman, well then we're talking significant land holdings, rights to collect taxes from certain villages, valuable jewels, and maybe even political offices. The bigger the dowry, the more advantageous the marriage. Now what happened to the dowry after the marriage? Good question. Legally, it usually became the property of the husband, giving him control over it. But, and this is a big but, it was often understood that the dowry was intended to provide for the wife's support during the marriage, and to secure her future should her husband predecease her. It was supposed to be in effect a safety net. This is where things could get tricky. A husband who squandered his wife's dowry was not only acting irresponsibly, he was potentially endangering her future security, and depending on local customs, could face social disapproval, even legal repercussions. See, there were usually agreements, prenuptial agreements, that specified what happened to the dowry if the husband died before the wife. Usually she got it all back. Of course, that didn't always happen in practice. And what about if the marriage failed? That's where it gets extra interesting. Although divorce as we understand it was pretty rare, annulments were possible, and separations were not unheard of. In such cases, the dowry usually should have been returned to the wife's family. But again, enforcing that wasn't always easy, especially if the husband was powerful or unscrupulous. This whole setup really highlights how economically vulnerable medieval women were. Their security, their livelihoods, was so very often dependent on the actions and the goodwill of men, their fathers and then their husbands. Bride wealth, as I mentioned earlier, was much less common in the later Middle Ages, but it's still worth understanding. It was more typical in poorer communities, where tangible goods were more valuable than land or titles. The groom's family might offer livestock, tools, or even just a promise of future labor to the bride's family. This wasn't just a transaction though, it was often seen as a way of solidifying the bond between the two families, kind of an investment in their future relationship. Okay, so we've been talking about economics, but it's crucial to remember these transactions weren't just about money. They were deeply intertwined with social expectations, gender roles, and power dynamics. The dowry, for example, reinforced the idea that women were to some extent economic burdens. They needed to be provided for. It also highlighted the father's responsibility to ensure his daughter's well-being in marriage. Bride wealth, on the other hand, in places where it existed, could actually give women more leverage. It recognized their value as workers and contributors to the family economy. It emphasized that they weren't just being taken off their father's hands, but that the groom's family was actively gaining something valuable by bringing her into their household. Over time, the significance of dowries and bride wealth shifted. As the medieval period drew to a close, and we moved toward the Renaissance and the early modern period, dowries became even more entrenched as a symbol of status and wealth. Families would go to great lengths, sometimes even bankrupting themselves, to provide a daughter with a suitable dowry, hoping to secure her a good marriage and elevate the family's social standing. So, there you have it, a peek into the fascinating and sometimes troubling world of medieval marriage economics. Dowries and bride wealth weren't just about money, they were about power, status, and the complex web of social expectations that shaped the lives of men and women in the Middle Ages. It's a good reminder that marriage wasn't always about finding the one, but was often a carefully negotiated agreement with significant economic and social implications. Sleep tight. Alright, so let's dive into the murky waters of age and consent back in the medieval days. Spoiler alert, it's not exactly a straightforward story. We're talking about a time when the rules about growing up were, well, let's just say they were different. Super different. So what was the deal with age and consent in medieval marriages? It's tempting to think of it as a free-for-all, but there were structures in place, even if they seem pretty wild to us today. We gotta remember though, that the whole concept of consent was viewed through a very different lens. First up, let's talk about the church. Always a big player in these kinds of things, right? Canon law, that's church law, set the minimum age for marriage surprisingly low. Like really low. For girls it was 12, for boys, 14. Yep, you heard that right. 12 and 14. Now these ages weren't chosen at random. They were supposedly the ages at which a person was considered capable of, well, you know, the birds and the bees. Time of puberty and all that. But here's the catch. Just because the church said these were the minimum ages, didn't mean everyone was cool with it. Even back then, there were debates. Some theologians argued that while a marriage could technically be valid at those ages, it shouldn't be encouraged. Basically, yeah, technically legal, but maybe pump the brakes, folks. Then you have the legal frameworks. Civil law, that's law made by kings and lords and all that. The rules here were a little bit more diverse and varied depending on the region. Some places adopted the church's ages, others had higher minimums, like 15, 60. Progress? Now here's where it gets even more complicated. Even if someone was technically old enough to marry according to the law, the idea of true free consent was often, let's just say it was more of a suggestion, especially for women. We gotta remember that most marriages, particularly amongst the nobility and wealthy merchant classes, were all about alliances and money. Love? Secondary. If it was even on the list at all. Marriages were contracts, sealing deals between families. So a young woman might be pressured, strongly, by her family to marry someone, even if she wasn't thrilled about it. Think about it. Dad says, hey, you're gonna marry the Duke of Bumbleberry. He's got land power and keeps talking about his bunions. What's a teenage girl gonna do? Say no and risk, like, family disownment? Not exactly a ton of great options. And let's be real, the power dynamics were insane. Dads, brothers, even uncles held a ton of sway over a young woman's future. This kind of pressure often blurred the lines between arrangement and forced marriage. Not a great look. Of course, there was some pushback against this. The church, for all its faults, did, at least in theory, require some form of consent from both parties. If someone could prove they were forced into a marriage, there was a chance, a small one mind you, of getting it annulled. But proving that, oof, good luck with that. And it wasn't just about outright force, psychological pressure, threats, emotional manipulation. These were all tools that families used to get their kids to toe the line. And proving that, in a medieval court, almost impossible. Then you have the whole societal aspect. Back then, being unmarried, especially for a woman, was not exactly a recipe for a great life. There was social stigma, limited economic opportunities. You were pretty much reliant on your family. So even if a young woman didn't want to get married, the alternatives often looked even worse. Now, it's important to mention that not every marriage was a forced affair, especially amongst peasants and lower classes. They had more freedom, less political and financial pressures, and a bit more say in their partnerships. It wasn't perfect by any means, but there was more room for love and mutual choice. So to sum it all up, age and consent in medieval marriages, a complex and often unsettling topic. The minimum ages were low, the pressure to marry was high, and the concept of free informed consent was, well, it varied. Societal norms, legal frameworks, and those pesky power dynamics all played a role in shaping medieval unions. It's a far cry from the way we view marriage today, and a reminder of just how much things have and haven't changed. Alright, let's cozy up and dive into the world of medieval marriage expectations. Think of it as a job description, but with considerably higher stakes and far fewer escape clauses. So imagine settling in, lighting a candle, and let's whisper our way through the roles, responsibilities, and especially those oh-so-complicated gender dynamics. Firstly, forget about love at first sight, or even love that develops after the wedding. While exceptions did happen, happen, and we will hear about them in the case studies. Most medieval marriages, particularly amongst the upper classes, were about securing alliances, consolidating wealth, and producing legitimate heirs. Romance. A delightful bonus, but hardly the primary objective. Now, let's break down those roles. The husband. The lord of the manor or the master of his trade. His primary responsibility, protection and provision. He was expected to safeguard his family, defend his land, and ensure a steady supply of income, be it from the farm, his craft, or the rents collected. He was the face of the household in the wider world, the one who engaged in legal and political matters. In short, his job was to keep everyone safe and fed, and of course to father legitimate children, sons preferably. But here's where it gets interesting. Protection wasn't just about warding off invading armies. It also meant maintaining order within the household. This included disciplining the wife, children and servants. Now, before anyone starts getting defensive, let's remember the context. Medieval society was hierarchical and based on the father figure. This did unfortunately give husbands significant power over their wives, and abuse, while frowned upon, was hard to prosecute, and sometimes seen as the husband doing what was required of him. And what about the wife? Well, her duties were largely confined to the domestic sphere. Managing the household was a major undertaking, especially in larger estates. Think of it as being the CEO of a small business, only the business was keeping everyone fed, clothed, and healthy. She oversaw the servants, managed the stores of food, ensured the smooth running of daily life. Childbearing was of course a central expectation. Producing heirs was paramount, especially for noble families. A woman's status and security often depended on her ability to produce children, and unfortunately repeated pregnancies could take a heavy toll on a woman's health. Midwifery was a complex and not always safe business. Beyond that, she was expected to be pious, chaste, and obedient. Her reputation was crucial, not only for her own sake, but for the honor of her family. A woman's virtue was directly linked to her family's social standing. But it would be naive to think of medieval women as simply meek and submissive. Many were intelligent, resourceful, and wielded considerable influence, especially in managing the household and influencing their husbands. Now, let's gently slide into the gender dynamics, the unspoken rules that governed interactions between men and women. Medieval society was deeply patriarchal. Men were considered naturally superior to women, both physically and intellectually. This belief shaped every aspect of marriage, from the allocation of roles to the expectations of behavior. Women were often viewed as weaker, more emotional, and more susceptible to temptation. This perception was rooted in religious beliefs, particularly the story of Eve and the fall of mankind. This of course impacted their legal rights, their access to education, and their overall status in society. However, it's important not to paint too simplistic a picture. The reality was far more nuanced. While men held formal authority, women often exerted considerable informal influence. A clever wife could sway her husband's decisions, manage her estate effectively, and even play a role in politics, albeit behind the scenes. Also, social class mattered greatly. A peasant woman might have worked alongside her husband in the fields, contributing directly to the family's income, while a noble woman might have been confined to the castle walls, managing the household and raising children. Their experiences were vastly different. It's also worth noting that the idealized image of the submissive wife was often at odds with the reality of medieval life. Many women, particularly in the lower classes, were strong, independent, and actively involved in economic activities. They ran businesses, managed farms, and even engaged in trades, proving that medieval women were a force to be reckoned with. Lastly, let's ponder briefly how this all shaped the failure of medieval marriages. If expectations were not met, or if one spouse failed to fulfill their expected role, tensions could certainly arise. A barren wife, a spendthrift husband, an unfaithful spouse, all could lead to conflict, and in some cases the dissolution of the marriage, or at least attempts to wriggle free of it. Ultimately, understanding the marital expectations, those roles, responsibilities, and those complicated gender dynamics is crucial to understanding the landscape of medieval marriage, its strengths, its limitations, and those cracks that sometimes led to its eventual breaking point. So, there you have it, a little medieval marriage story before it's time for sleep. Alright, let's dive into a particularly messy aspect of medieval marriage, infidelity. Now, when we talk about infidelity back then, we're not just talking about a casual fling that might make the tabloids today. We're talking about a fundamental breach of contract, a violation of religious vows, and a serious threat to the entire social order. So buckle up, because things are about to get complicated. First off, the social stigma. Oh boy, the social stigma. Think of the worst reality TV drama you've ever seen, multiply it by 10, and set it in a tight-knit community where everyone knows everyone else's business. That's medieval society. If word got out that a spouse was being unfaithful, it wasn't just a private matter, it was public entertainment, a source of gossip, and a major blow to the family's reputation. For women, the stigma was astronomically worse. A woman caught in adultery was often branded a fallen woman, her reputation ruined beyond repair. She could be ostracized, shamed publicly, and even physically punished, depending on the severity of the situation and the social status of those involved. Think scarlet letters, public stonings, the whole 9 yards, though those were, by and large, rare. The real punishment was often a life of isolation and shame, her chances of remarrying slim to none, her family's honor tarnished forever. Now, let's talk about the legal consequences. This is where things get really interesting, and where those delightful double standards start to creep in. The laws surrounding infidelity varied depending on the region, the social class, and the whims of local lords, but some general trends emerge. The church, of course, had a lot to say about it. Adultery was a sin, plain and simple. Canon law, the church's legal system, considered marriage a sacrament, a sacred bond that couldn't be broken lightly. Infidelity was a violation of that sacrament and could lead to excommunication, meaning being kicked out of the church, which in medieval times was a pretty big deal. But the church's power was often limited when it came to dealing with the legal ramifications of infidelity. Secular courts, run by kings, lords, and other local authorities, also had jurisdiction, and their punishments could be far more severe. For men, legal consequences for infidelity were often, well, let's just say lighter isn't a strong enough word. While adultery was technically illegal for both men and women, the reality was that men often got away with it scot-free, especially if they were of high social standing. A nobleman who had an affair might face some social disapproval, maybe a stern talking to from his wife's family, but rarely anything more. His reputation might take a hit, but his social and political power would likely remain intact. A husband might seek legal recourse against his wife's lover, though. This wasn't necessarily about punishing the lover for moral reasons, but more about protecting his property and lineage. A wife's adultery could introduce illegitimate children into the family, muddying the line of inheritance. A husband could sue the lover for damages, basically demanding financial compensation for the offense. In some regions, a husband even had the right to kill his wife's lover if he caught them in the act. This was often justified as a defense of his honor and his family's integrity. However, if the husband killed his wife, that would typically be seen as simple murder. Again, double standards. But what about the wife? What recourse did she have if her husband was unfaithful? Well, that's where the double standards really kicked in. In most cases, a wife had very little legal recourse against her adulterous husband. She couldn't sue his lover. She couldn't divorce him. She was pretty much stuck. In some rare cases, a wife might be able to seek a legal separation, but this was usually only granted if the husband's infidelity was particularly egregious religious, or if it put the wife in physical danger. Even then, the wife might not be able to take her dowry back, leaving her financially vulnerable. And now, let's talk about the double standards in more detail, because they're really the heart of the matter here. Medieval society operated on a deeply patriarchal system, where men were seen as the heads of the household, and women were expected to be obedient and subservient. This power imbalance permeated every aspect of life, including marriage and infidelity. Men, especially those of high social standing, were often given a wide berth when it came to their sexual behavior. It was often seen as a sign of their virility and power, as long as they didn't openly flaunt their affairs or neglect their marital duties. They could often get away with a certain amount of infidelity without facing serious consequences. Women, on the other hand, were held to a much higher standard. Their primary role was to bear legitimate heirs and maintain the household. Any deviation from this role was seen as a threat to the family's honor and the social order. This meant that women were expected to be chaste, faithful, and completely devoted to their husbands. This double standard was often justified by religious beliefs. Women were seen as more susceptible to temptation and more likely to commit sin. They were often portrayed as the descendants of Eve, the woman who tempted Adam in the Garden of Eden. This made them inherently untrustworthy and in need of constant supervision. But I mean, the reality, of course, was that people are people. Those in power will often abuse it. So what happens when infidelity could be used to end a marriage? Well, not often, but sometimes. So what if you had a pre-arranged marriage? Your family, they say, get married, it'll be great. But then the married couple is, well, it turns out, bad. Well, as we'll see later with divorce, there were lots of sneaky things people did to end a marriage. But in the social world of what's proper, it's hard. Let's just leave it at that. In conclusion, infidelity in medieval marriage was a complex issue with serious social, legal, and religious ramifications. The consequences of infidelity varied greatly depending on the gender and social status of those involved, with women facing far harsher penalties than men. The double standards of medieval society reinforced this inequality, perpetuating a system where men were given more freedom and women were held to a much higher standard of fidelity. And so, things go. Now, let's talk about desertion. Okay, so let's talk about what happened when those medieval vows didn't quite stick. I mean, you've got this whole system built on the idea of till death do us part, but life finds a way, right? Especially when life is incredibly hard and marriage is often more like a business deal than a love story. And that's where we have to talk about good old desertion and abandonment. Think about it. The church is preaching that marriage is sacred and unbreakable. Society's telling you that your family's honor and your economic stability depend on it. But what happens when one half of that equation just vanishes? Desertion in the medieval world wasn't quite like hitting up Vegas and filing divorce papers from a drive-through window. It wasn't a legal loophole or a matter of simply signing some forms and moving on, because leaving could have a whole mess of consequences. It's a really big deal, especially for women, like really big. We're talking about social ostracism, potential accusations of witchcraft, or even just complete economic ruin depending on the situation. For men, well, it wasn't a picnic either, but generally speaking they had a bit more wiggle room. Society was just unfortunately a little kinder to the wandering male spouse. However, they risked fines, legal repercussions from the church, and even less savory punishments. But let's be honest, for a peasant whose life consisted of unrelenting farm labor, the risk might just be worth it sometimes. Now, why did people actually ditch their marriages? Well, put yourself in their shoes. Maybe you were forced into a union with someone you absolutely loathed. Perhaps your spouse was abusive, either physically or emotionally, and there was just no recourse available. Maybe the economic pressures were just too much. Famine, disease, constant warfare, these things could push anyone to the brink. And sometimes, let's just be frank, people simply fell in love with someone else, or just got incredibly bored with their assigned partner. Maybe they got tired of their families and their way to change things was to start a new life somewhere else. Yeah, affairs were one thing, but completely abandoning one's spouse, that was an entirely different level of rebellion, and it came with significant risks. What did it look like though? How did people actually go about deserting their spouses when they couldn't just hop on a plane or even catch a stagecoach? Well, imagine a peasant husband, let's call him Thomas. Thomas has been married to Agnes for 15 years. They have 4 kids, a tiny plot of land that yields barely enough to feed them all. And Agnes, well, Agnes has a really bad temper. Every day is a struggle, a constant battle against poverty, and Agnes's constant nagging. One morning, Thomas simply doesn't come back from the forest. He told Agnes he was going to cut some firewood, but instead, he just keeps walking. He might head to the next village, find work as a day laborer, and adopt a new name. He becomes John, the quiet guy who keeps to himself and never talks about his past. Agnes is left to fend for herself, relying on the charity of the community and the meager earnings of her children. If she's lucky, she could remarry, but her prospects aren't looking great with 4 hungry mouths to feed. Or imagine a noblewoman, Lady Eleanor. She was married off to Lord Humphrey, a man twice her age, for the sole purpose of securing a strategic alliance between their families. Lord Humphrey is a cruel, vindictive man who spends most of his time drinking and gambling, and Lady Eleanor is miserable. One day, while visiting a neighbouring estate, Lady Eleanor meets Sir Reginald. He's handsome, charming, and treats her with kindness and respect. They fall in love, a forbidden and dangerous love. One night, under the cover of darkness, Lady Eleanor and Sir Reginald elope. They flee to the continent, hoping to find refuge in a distant court where their past won't follow them. Lord Humphrey is furious, of course. He demands that the church declare the marriage invalid and hunts them down with ruthless determination. But Lady Eleanor is willing to risk everything for a chance at happiness. See, those are 2 very different situations, right? But the underlying theme is the same, a desperate attempt to escape an intolerable situation. But what happened after the desertion? What were the legal and social ramifications? Well, the church definitely didn't approve. Canon law, that set of rules the church operated under, strongly condemned desertion. A spouse who was abandoned could petition the church courts to demand their partner return. If they refused, well, that could lead to excommunication, which was basically social and spiritual death. But enforcement was tricky. How do you force someone to return when they've vanished into thin air? And what if the deserted spouse simply didn't want them back? The church was stuck between wanting to uphold the sanctity of marriage and not wanting to force people into horrific situations. For the abandoned spouse, particularly women, the consequences could be devastating. Remember, medieval society offered women very little economic independence. If a husband deserted his wife, she could be left destitute, dependent on the charity of her relatives or the community. She might be forced to beg, to prostitute herself, or even to abandon her children in order to survive. And then there's the social stigma. An abandoned woman was often viewed with suspicion, even blamed for her husband's departure. People might whisper that she was a shrew, a bad wife, or even, gasp, a witch. This made it even harder for her to find work, to remarry, or even just to maintain her reputation. Men didn't have it easy either. While they had better odds for self-sustaining, it was often only enough to feed themselves. Being the main support for the family, their disappearances would leave families without resource, and often angry villagers. But what about the children? Yeah, they often got it the worst. Desertion could tear families apart, leaving children without one or both parents to care for them. They might be forced into work at a young age, or become homeless wanderers, vulnerable to exploitation and disease. Their futures were often irrevocably damaged by the actions of their parents. Now, did the deserted spouse have any recourse? Could they actually get out of the marriage and start fresh? The answer, as with most things in the Middle Ages, is, it's complicated. Formerly, the church maintained that marriage was indissoluble, so a deserted spouse couldn't simply get a divorce and remarry. That was strictly forbidden. But there were loopholes. Remember annulments? An annulment declared that the marriage had never been valid in the first place due to some pre-existing impediment, and, in some cases, a long period of desertion could be used as evidence to support an annulment. If someone was gone long enough, the church might consider that as proof that the marriage was non-consummated or just that one spouse was essentially dead, clearing the path for an annulment. But this process was expensive, lengthy, and often depended on the influence and connections of the individuals involved. Plus, it could result in huge legal consequences from both sides. Informally, there were other options. Sometimes, communities would simply accept that a marriage was over, even if the church didn't officially recognize it. The deserted spouse might find a new partner, and the community might turn a blind eye, as long as things were done discreetly. This was especially common among the peasantry, where practical considerations often outweighed strict adherence to church doctrine. Desertion and abandonment. It's a dark side of medieval marriage, a reminder that even the most sacred institutions can be broken by human desperation, societal pressures, and, well, just plain old human frailty. It highlights the vulnerability of women and children in a society where economic and social power was so unevenly distributed. And it shows that even in an age of faith and tradition, people were willing to risk everything for a chance at a better life. Or maybe just a life they could finally tolerate. Okay, so let's talk about annulment. That is, what were the grounds for saying, oops, this marriage never actually happened in the eyes of the medieval church? Because remember, for Catholics, marriage was a sacrament, and sacraments are kinda supposed to be, permanent. Now, the church took marriage seriously, like really seriously. They saw it as divinely ordained, a union blessed by God Himself. But even with all that, they realized sometimes things went wrong, terribly wrong. So they had a system, a loophole if you will, for declaring a marriage invalid from the start. That's the key thing here. An annulment wasn't a divorce. A divorce acknowledges a valid marriage took place, but it's being dissolved. An annulment says the marriage never existed, like it was all a bad dream. Poof. Gone. Didn't happen. So what kind of stuff could get you an annulment back then? Well, the rules were incredibly specific, and honestly, pretty strange sometimes. First up, let's talk about consanguinity and affinity. Basically, this boils down to being related to your spouse, and I don't just mean immediate family, we're talking like distant cousins, like really distant. The church was obsessed with preventing incest, so they had these elaborate charts mapping out family trees. If you were related within the forbidden degrees, which was pretty wide back then, you were out of luck. The marriage was invalid, and the fun part, it wasn't just blood relations. Affinity also mattered. That meant you couldn't marry someone related to a former spouse either. It all got very complicated, and could be used to annul a marriage of convenience by powerful families. And then there was lack of consent. This sounds simple, but it gets tricky. Both parties had to freely consent to the marriage. But what if you were, say, a young noblewoman, forced into a marriage by your powerful father for political gain? Could you claim lack of consent later? Maybe. It depended. Proving it was another matter entirely. The church courts would look at all sorts of evidence, letters, testimonies from witnesses, and try to determine if genuine consent was there. This was harder for women than men, given the societal assumption that women were subject to the will of their fathers or guardians. Another ground for annulment. Prior vows. If one of you had taken religious vows, become a monk, a nun, anything like that, before the marriage, well, guess what? Your vows trumped the marriage. You were already spoken for, spiritually. This one's fairly straightforward, but it could cause problems if someone conveniently remembered taking vows years after the wedding. Impotence was also a biggie. The church saw procreation as one of the primary purposes of marriage. If one partner was permanently unable to have children, the marriage could be annulled. This wasn't about infertility, mind you. This was about physical inability to consummate the marriage. So if a man was completely physically unable to perform, or a woman had a physical condition that made intercourse impossible, that could be grounds for annulment. Getting proof. Now that was awkward. Doctors or midwives would have to give testimonies in court, and it could turn into a really uncomfortable process. Then there were pre-existing marriages. This one's pretty obvious. You can't be married to two people at once. Bigamy was a no-no. So if it turned out your spouse already had a living spouse somewhere else, your marriage was instantly invalid. Of course, proving that prior marriage existed could be a challenge, especially if it was in a far-off land. People would go off to war and never come back all the time, so proof could be really difficult. Here's a weird one. Spiritual relationship. This meant that if you were a godparent to your spouse's child, that created a spiritual kinship that was considered an impediment to marriage. It was like you were too close to the family already, in a spiritual sense, to then marry into it. This sounds bizarre to us now, but it was a real concern back then. Abduction and forced marriage was another ground. If you were kidnapped and forced into a marriage, you could petition for an annulment once you were free. The church recognized that genuine consent couldn't exist under duress. However, there was a catch. If the marriage was eventually consummated after you were free, it would be seen as proof that you accepted the marriage. And finally, there was mistake of person. This sounds like something out of a comedy, but it could happen. If you genuinely believed you were marrying one person, but it turned out to be someone else entirely, well, that's not a valid marriage. This was more likely to happen in arranged marriages where the parties hadn't actually met before the wedding. Now, getting an annulment wasn't easy. It involved a long, complicated process in the church courts. You needed to present evidence, witnesses, and make your case before the ecclesiastical judges. And of course, if you were wealthy and powerful, you had a much better chance of getting what you wanted. Kings and nobles often used annulments as a convenient way to get rid of unwanted wives and secure more politically advantageous marriages. Think Henry VIII. And what about the children from these annulled marriages? Well, that depended. If the annulment was granted because of something like consanguinity, the children were often declared illegitimate, which had huge consequences for their inheritance and social standing. But if the annulment was based on something like lack of consent, the children might be considered legitimate, particularly if one or both parents acted in good faith. It was a complex and inconsistent area of law. So, annulment in the medieval ages, not a get-out-of-jail-free card for unhappy couples. It was a complicated, often political process with strict rules and significant consequences. And really, for most people, it wasn't even a remote possibility. But for those with power and influence, it was a tool that could reshape dynasties and change the course of history. Alright, so after all that wedding fuss, what happened when things, well, didn't work out? Medieval marriages were meant to be for life, practically set in stone by the church. But life, as always, found a way to wiggle free. Today, we're diving into the murky world of separation, the informal agreements, the legal loopholes, and the sheer grit people needed to carve out some space when "till death do us part" felt more like a prison sentence. Now, divorce as we know it, pretty much a no-go. The church, as we discussed, viewed marriage as a sacrament, an unbreakable bond ordained by God. But surprise, surprise, even the most ironclad rules sometimes bent under pressure. So, what were the options? First up, and probably the most common, was informal separation. Think of it as the medieval version of consciously uncoupling, except without the Goop-approved wellness retreats. Basically, a husband and wife would agree, sometimes privately, sometimes with family mediation, that they just couldn't live together anymore. Maybe they argued constantly, maybe one was abusive, maybe they simply grew to despise each other's lute playing. Whatever the reason, they'd decide to live apart. This could look different depending on their social class. For peasants, it might mean one partner moving to another village, maybe finding work on a different farm. For merchants, it could mean separate residences in the same town, or one partner focusing on business in another city. For the nobility, well, things got complicated. Land, titles, and inheritance were all tangled up in the marriage knot, so a formal legal agreement was often necessary, even if it wasn't a full-blown divorce. These informal separations weren't legally binding in the way we understand them. There wasn't a court order, no official document. It was more of a social agreement, a mutual understanding. This meant it was often precarious. One party could, at any time, decide to return and reclaim their marital rights. And of course, these separations could be particularly difficult for women, who often lacked economic independence and were socially vulnerable without the protection of a husband. But here's where things get interesting. Even without formal divorce, there were still legal avenues people could explore to escape an unhappy marriage. And most of the time, this involved a loophole. Think of it as playing the medieval legal system, like a game of chess, looking for any possible checkmate or flaw in your opponent's argument. One popular option was to claim affinity, or that the spouses were related by blood or spiritual kinship, like being godparents to the same child, closer than the church allowed. Canon law prohibited marriage between relatives up to a certain degree of consanguinity. So, if you could prove that you were, say, third cousins, or that your great-grandparents had shared a wet nurse, you might be able to get an annulment. Finding this consanguinity often involved some creative genealogy, let's just say. Witnesses might be persuaded to remember family connections that conveniently rendered the marriage invalid. It was a bit like medieval ancestry, only with much higher stakes and far more potential for fabrication. Another approach was to argue that the marriage was never valid in the first place. Maybe one party was underage, or coerced into the marriage, or already secretly married to someone else. These arguments were trickier to prove, but if you could convince the church court that the marriage was fundamentally flawed from the outset, you might have a shot at annulment. Then there were cases of impotence. If one spouse could prove that the other was incapable of consummating the marriage, and yes, this often involved some rather intimate examinations by medical experts and sworn testimonies, the church might grant an annulment. Imagine having to demonstrate your lack of ability in a court of law. Yikes. And of course, there were also a few very niche reasons and arguments that were brought before the courts. If one spouse took religious vows and wanted to enter a monastery, they would argue for annulment so they could continue their religious calling. If one spouse was accused of witchcraft and convicted, that was sometimes grounds for separation. It really just came down to what crazy argument you could put before the courts. Keep in mind, even when someone managed to secure a separation, it wasn't always a clean break. Especially for noble families, there would often be protracted negotiations over property, dowries, and the custody of children. These agreements could take years to finalize, and often involved considerable legal wrangling. Speaking of dowries, they often played a central role in separation agreements. A woman's dowry was her contribution to the marriage, and if the marriage ended, she was usually entitled to get it back. This could be a significant sum of money, land or goods, and reclaiming it could be a major financial blow to the husband and his family. So you can imagine, negotiations over the dowry were often fiercely contested. And then there were the children. Custody arrangements were limited, to say the least. In most cases, the father had primary rights over the children, especially male heirs. Mothers might be granted visitation rights, or allowed to care for younger children until a certain age, but the father generally controlled their upbringing and education. This often left women in a difficult position, forced to choose between their own freedom and the well-being of their children. So separation in the Middle Ages wasn't easy. It was a messy, complicated process, fraught with social stigma, legal hurdles, and economic uncertainties. It was a testament to the human desire for autonomy, for the right to choose one's own path, even within the confines of a rigid social system. And next time we'll be delving into the dark side of marriage failures with a look at domestic violence, a harsh reality that many medieval spouses, particularly women, had to endure. Alright, so let's talk about something that's honestly pretty difficult to stomach when we think about the past domestic violence. It's definitely not a fun topic, but it's a really important one if we want to understand the full picture of what marriage was actually like back in medieval times. Buckle in, because this might be a bit rough. Now, before we even dive in, it's crucial to understand this violence within marriage wasn't some rare, isolated incident. Historians generally agree it was way more common than we'd like to think. Problem is, getting solid numbers is, well, next to impossible. Think about it. We're talking about centuries ago. Most everyday people didn't leave behind diaries detailing their lives, let alone their abuse. Records from church courts or local manors sometimes give us glimpses, but these are usually just the tip of the iceberg. Most cases probably went unreported, hidden behind closed doors, shrouded in shame and social expectations. And those social expectations, yeah, they were a big part of the problem. Medieval society was deeply patriarchal. Men held most of the power, and women were legally and socially subordinate. This created an environment where a husband's authority over his wife was often seen as absolute, even extending to physical discipline. I know, it's awful. Some religious and philosophical writings of the time even seemed to condone moderate chastisement, arguing that it was a husband's duty to correct his wife's behavior. Like, seriously, no, this wasn't a free-for-all though. Even within that patriarchal structure, there were limits, at least in theory. Excessive violence, the kind that caused serious injury or death, was generally frowned upon by the church and by secular authorities. But excessive was pretty subjective, wasn't it? And proving it, even harder. One of the biggest problems for women was the lack of legal recourse. If a woman did try to report abuse, her options were incredibly limited. Church courts might intervene in cases of extreme cruelty, especially if it threatened the sanctity of the marriage itself. But again, extreme cruelty was open to interpretation, and the burden of proof was almost entirely on the woman. And then there's the issue of class. If you were a noble woman, you might have had slightly more protection simply because your family had the power and influence to intervene. A powerful lord wasn't going to let his daughter be openly mistreated because it reflected badly on his own status. But for peasant women, or women from merchant families without much clout, the situation was far more dire. They were often completely dependent on their husbands for survival, and lacked the social connections or financial resources to escape an abusive situation. Now, the types of violence women faced varied, of course. Physical assault was common: beatings, slaps, kicks, use of household objects as weapons. Verbal abuse was probably even more widespread. Things like constant insults, threats, and humiliation. And let's not forget about sexual violence. Marital rape, while never explicitly condoned, was essentially legal. The idea that a wife had the right to refuse her husband's sexual advances was pretty much non-existent. So basically, a woman's body wasn't really her own. It's just horrifying. What makes this all even sadder is how isolated many women must have felt. Shame and societal pressure kept many from speaking out. They feared being ostracized, blamed, or even punished for disobeying their husbands. Can you imagine being trapped like that? It's heartbreaking. And just to make things extra bleak, even if a woman did manage to separate from her abusive husband, she often faced severe economic hardship. Medieval society offered few options for single women to support themselves, especially if they lacked skills or family support. So many felt forced to return to abusive marriages, simply to survive. Talk about being stuck between a rock and a hard place. There are a few glimmers of hope in this otherwise grim picture though. Some medieval texts did advocate for the protection of women, condemning violence against them, and emphasizing the importance of mutual respect within marriage. And we see instances of women taking matters into their own hands, defying social expectations and seeking help from family, friends, or even the local community. These acts of resistance were rare, but they remind us that even in the darkest of times, there were always people who refused to accept injustice. So yeah, domestic violence in medieval marriages was a really serious problem. It was fueled by patriarchal attitudes, limited legal protections, and a culture of silence. While it's easy to romanticize the past, it's crucial that we acknowledge the harsh realities faced by so many women. By understanding the challenges they faced, we can gain a deeper appreciation for the progress that's been made, and recognize that the fight against domestic violence is far from over, even today. It's a somber thought, but important. Thanks for sticking with me through this one. Okay, so picture this. A medieval marriage goes belly up. We've already covered the infidelity, the desertions, even accusations of witchcraft, but what happens when it all boils down to cold hard cash, or land, or livestock? That's where inheritance disputes come crashing in, folks. It's property rights and family conflicts, medieval style. Think succession, but with way more swords and questionable hygiene. See, in the Middle Ages, marriage wasn't just about lovey-dovey feelings, it was a huge economic and social contract. Land, titles, and wealth were all tied to family lines, and marriage was the glue that held it all together. So when a marriage went sour, or more dramatically, when one spouse shuffled off this mortal coil, things got messy, really messy. We're talking years of legal battles, bitter rivalries, and enough family drama to fill a Shakespearean tragedy. Let's start with the basics: property rights. Now, the rules varied a bit depending on the region and the social class, but generally, there were two main types of property involved: the wife's dowry, and any property acquired during the marriage. The dowry, my friends, was basically the bride's family's contribution to the marriage. Think of it as a reverse bride price. It could include land, money, jewelry, livestock, pretty much anything of value. The idea was to provide the wife with financial security, both during the marriage and in widowhood. It was her safety net. Now, in theory, the dowry was supposed to be returned to the wife or her family if the marriage ended for specific reasons, like annulment, or, if the husband was a complete jerk. But good luck actually getting it back. Then you had the property acquired during the marriage. This was trickier. Depending on local customs, this property might be jointly owned, or it might be considered the husband's property outright. If the marriage ended, figuring out who owned what could lead to some seriously nasty fights, especially if there were children involved. And that's where the real fireworks started, because let's be honest, kids were often used as pawns in these inheritance games. The big question was always, who gets custody, and more importantly, who controls their inheritance? In most cases, especially among the nobility, the father had the stronger claim. He was seen as the head of the household, the protector of the family line, and the natural guardian of the children's interests. But if the father was, shall we say, unsuitable, maybe he was a gambler, an alcoholic, or just plain incompetent, the mother's family might step in to try and wrest control of the children and their inheritance. And you can just imagine the legal battles. We're talking about powerful families going head to head, hiring the best lawyers, or whatever passed for lawyers back then, and pulling every string they could to win. Accusations would fly, witnesses would be bribed, and sometimes, things would even turn violent. All for the sake of securing that sweet, sweet inheritance. Now, let's throw another wrench into the works. Illegitimate children. Oh boy, this is where things get really complicated. In the eyes of the church and the law, illegitimate children had very limited rights. They generally couldn't inherit land or titles, although there were exceptions, especially if the father formally recognized them. But that didn't stop them from trying to claim a piece of the pie. You'd often see illegitimate sons challenging the claims of legitimate heirs, arguing that their father had loved them more, that they were more capable, or that, their dad secretly wanted them to have everything. It was a long shot, but sometimes it worked. And what about daughters? Well, they often got the short end of the stick. In many parts of Europe, daughters were excluded from inheriting land, especially if there were sons. The idea was to keep the family estate intact, and dividing it among multiple heirs would weaken the family's power. So daughters were often pushed towards marriage, with their dowry serving as their inheritance. Or they were encouraged to take the veil and join a convent, which strangely could sometimes offer them more autonomy than marriage. But even if daughters could inherit, they still faced an uphill battle. They were expected to be subservient to their male relatives, and their inheritance could be controlled by their husbands or brothers. It was a man's world, folks, and women had to fight tooth and nail for every scrap of power. So what was the result of all this fighting? Well, often it was years of legal wrangling, leaving families fractured and fortunes drained by legal fees. Sometimes compromises would be reached, with each side getting a piece of what they wanted. Other times one side would emerge victorious, leaving the other bitter and resentful. And occasionally, things would escalate into outright warfare, with families literally battling each other for control of land and resources. But beyond the legal and financial aspects, these inheritance disputes had a profound impact on families. They could destroy relationships between siblings, tear apart communities, and create lasting animosity that would be passed down through generations. It was a high-stakes game, and the consequences could be devastating. And remember, all of this was happening against a backdrop of medieval life, poverty, disease, and constant warfare. So these inheritance disputes weren't just abstract legal battles, they were about survival. They were about securing a future for yourself and your family in a harsh and unforgiving world. And that's why they were so important, and so messy. So next time you're watching a show about feuding families, remember that this stuff has been going on for centuries. Medieval marriage, with all its complexities and contradictions, was often the source of some of the most intense family conflicts imaginable. And the fight for inheritance, that was just the icing on the cake. A delicious, albeit incredibly bitter, cake. Alright, so picture this. A medieval marriage goes south. Messy, right? But what happens to the kids? Well, buckle up, because child custody in the Middle Ages was, let's just say, not exactly enlightened. We're talking limited rights for mothers, like really limited, and the concept of the best interests of the child, mostly non-existent. It was all about the father's dominance, plain and simple. Think of it this way, marriage was often viewed as a contract, a business arrangement, a way to secure land, titles, or political alliances. Children, they were collateral, assets, extensions of the father's lineage and power. Now the church did have some influence here. They pushed for the idea that children were a blessing and that parents had a duty to raise them in the Christian faith. But even then, the father's authority was almost always paramount. So what were a mother's rights if a marriage broke down, either through annulment or, more commonly, informal separation? Short answer, slim to none. Unless she was from a particularly wealthy or powerful family, she likely had very little say in where her children lived or how they were raised. The father, as head of the household, was generally considered the natural guardian. He controlled the children's upbringing, their education if they received any, and most importantly, their future prospects. He decided who they would marry, what careers they would pursue, and how they would inherit property. Think about the nobility. If a noble marriage failed, the children, especially the male heirs, were absolutely vital to the continuation of the family line. The father or his family would fight tooth and nail to keep them. It was about maintaining power and prestige. The mother's feelings, not really part of the equation. And it wasn't just about noble families. Even among merchants and peasants, the father's role as the primary breadwinner and head of the family gave him significant control over his children. He needed them to help with the family business or on the farm. They were a crucial part of the economic unit. Now there were some exceptions. If the mother was from a higher social class than the father, or if she brought significant wealth or property to the marriage, she might have slightly more leverage. She might be able to negotiate some kind of agreement regarding access to her children. Widows also sometimes had more rights, particularly if their husbands had left provisions for them in their wills. A wealthy widow might be appointed guardian of her children, allowing her to control their upbringing and inheritance. But even then, she was often subject to the scrutiny and influence of male relatives, like her brothers or uncles. But for most women, especially those from lower social classes, leaving a marriage meant leaving their children behind. It was a heartbreaking reality. They might be able to visit them occasionally, if the father allowed it, but they had little to no control over their lives. And what about illegitimate children? Those kids were even more vulnerable. Their mothers often faced social stigma and economic hardship, and the fathers often denied any responsibility for their care. The church tried to encourage fathers to acknowledge and support their illegitimate children, but enforcement was weak. These kids often ended up in orphanages or simply fending for themselves. Now let's be clear, this wasn't always a cold-hearted, calculated decision. Sometimes fathers believed they were acting in the best interests of their children by keeping them. They might have genuinely believed that the mother was unfit to raise them, either because of her character, her social standing, or her economic circumstances. And it's important to remember the incredibly high mortality rates of the Middle Ages. If a mother died, the father automatically became the sole guardian of the children. There were no extended family custody battles like we see today. So what does all this tell us? Well, it paints a pretty grim picture of child custody in the Middle Ages. It was a system heavily weighted in favor of fathers, with limited rights for mothers, and little consideration for the individual needs and desires of the children themselves. It was a product of its time, a reflection of the patriarchal social structures and the economic realities of medieval life. And it serves as a stark reminder of how far we've come in our understanding of child welfare and parental rights. It definitely gives you pause to reflect on where society's values were, and how much the children must have suffered as a result. A tough but unfortunately true reality. Alright, so let's talk about what happened after someone in the Middle Ages, didn't make it. Like, after a spouse died, specifically remarriage. What were their options? It's surprisingly complicated. Losing a spouse back then was, well, it was a lot more common than it is now. Disease, childbirth, accidents. Life was just generally a lot riskier. So dealing with the aftermath of spousal death, including the possibility of finding a new partner, was a pretty regular part of medieval life. Now the big thing that shaped everything about remarriage was the church. Remember, the church held a ton of power in the Middle Ages, like shaping society level of power. And their view on marriage was pretty strict. They considered it a sacrament, a holy bond that ideally lasted forever. "Till death do us part" wasn't just a saying, it was the official position. But even with that, the church did acknowledge that death did happen. And honestly, they weren't total monsters about remarriage, sometimes. While the ideal was to remain widowed as a testament to the love for your first spouse, they also understood the practical realities, especially when it came to, well, continuing things that needed to be continued. For women especially, remarriage could be a necessity, unless they had independent wealth, which was pretty rare. Widows often depended on their husbands for survival. Remarriage provided security, a home, food on the table, and protection. A widow might need a new husband to manage her lands, run her business, or simply provide for her children. And for men, especially those of the noble class, remarriage was often seen as vital for continuing the family line. You needed an heir, right? And also running a large estate or a business by yourself could be, shall we say, a massive headache. A new wife could bring fresh resources, new connections, and of course the possibility of more children. But there were restrictions. Of course, first off, the church frowned on too much enthusiasm for remarriage. Like, if you were barely in the ground and your spouse was already planning the party, that was considered bad form. A period of mourning was definitely expected. How long? Well, that varied depending on social status and local custom, but rushing into a new marriage looked disrespectful. Then there was the issue of who you could marry. Canon law, church law prohibited marriage between close relatives, even by marriage. So marrying your dead wife's sister? Big no-no. And of course, you still needed the church's blessing for the marriage to be valid. Social status also played a huge role. For the nobility, remarriage was often a strategic move. They'd be looking for alliances. Did the potential new spouse have land, money, political connections? It was all part of the calculation. A noble widow with a valuable inheritance was obviously a very attractive proposition. However, noble families were also very picky. The pool of acceptable spouses was smaller because they needed someone of the right rank. Marrying down could damage the family's reputation and standing. For peasants, the considerations were more practical. They needed someone who could help on the farm, share the workload, and contribute to the household. Love was nice, sure, but survival was more important. Peasant widows and widowers might remarry fairly quickly, simply out of necessity. Now, women who remarried, especially wealthy widows, faced some unique challenges. They often had to navigate complex inheritance laws and prenuptial agreements. What property did they bring into the marriage? What rights did their children from the first marriage have? These things could be complicated. A smart widow would make sure her interests were protected before saying, "I do" again. The church also had some specific rules for women. They encouraged widows to remain chaste, to devote themselves to prayer and good works. It was considered a more virtuous path than remarriage. And of course, there was always the issue of gossip. A woman who remarried too quickly, or who seemed too eager for a new husband, might face social disapproval. People would talk, and let's be honest, medieval people loved to talk. So to sum it all up, remarriage in the Middle Ages was a complex thing. Opportunities were there, especially if you needed security, or heirs, or just someone to help run things. But it wasn't a free-for-all. The church, social status, inheritance laws, and even just good old-fashioned gossip all played a role in shaping who could remarry, when, and how. It was just one more way that life in the Middle Ages was never quite as simple as it looks in the movies, right? Time to snooze, all right. Let's settle in and talk about adultery trials in the Middle Ages, public shaming, and all the not-so-fun legal punishments. Yeah, things got pretty messy when vows were broken. So in the medieval world, marriage was like the cornerstone of society. The church hammered this home constantly, emphasizing its sacred, indissoluble nature. But surprise, surprise, people are people, and sometimes they strayed. When that happened, it wasn't just a private matter, it became a whole public ordeal, especially when adultery was involved. Think about it. A medieval town or village was a pretty tight-knit community. Everyone knew everyone else's business, so keeping an affair secret was tough, almost impossible. Whispers spread like wildfire, and before you knew it, the whole darn town was gossiping about who was sneaking off with whom. But gossip was just the beginning. If adultery was suspected, it could lead to a full-blown trial, usually held in either the church's court or the local secular court. The exact process depended on the specific region and the social status of those involved. For instance, if you were a noble, the stakes were way higher than if you were a peasant. Okay, let's say someone was accused of adultery. First, there had to be some kind of evidence. This could be anything from eyewitness accounts to, shall we say, compromising situations being discovered. Sometimes, even just strong suspicion was enough to kick things off. Remember, medieval justice wasn't always about cold, hard facts. Once the accusations were made, the accused would be brought before the court. Now, proving adultery wasn't always easy. You couldn't exactly take DNA tests or use hidden cameras back then. So they relied on stuff like sworn testimony, confessions, and sometimes even trial by ordeal. Yeah, like dunking someone in water to see if they were innocent or guilty. Fun times if someone was found guilty of adultery, and that's a big if, because the legal system was often biased, the punishments could be brutal. And this is where the public shaming comes in. One common punishment was being paraded through the town. Imagine being forced to walk through the streets, maybe in your underwear or some kind of humiliating outfit, while everyone jeered and threw rotten vegetables at you. Talk about embarrassing. This was meant to be a huge deterrent, showing everyone what happened if you messed around outside your marriage. Another popular form of shaming was the cucking stool or ducking stool. This involved being tied to a chair or stool and then dunked repeatedly into a river or pond. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was also a public spectacle designed to humiliate the offender in front of the whole community. And let's not forget the scarlet letter, medieval style. Adulterers might be forced to wear a specific piece of clothing, like a brightly colored hat or a badge, that marked them as sinners. This made them outcasts, constantly reminded of their transgression and subject to ridicule. But public shaming wasn't the only consequence. There were also legal punishments to deal with. These varied depending on your social class and the specific laws of the region. For women, the punishments were often harsher. They could face fines, imprisonment, or even banishment from the town. In some cases, they might have their hair shaved off as a sign of disgrace, and of course they could lose their dowry, leaving them financially ruined. Men weren't exactly off the hook though. They could also face fines and imprisonment. But often, the legal system was more lenient towards them, especially if they were powerful or influential. And that, my friends, is what we call a double standard. Medieval society wasn't exactly known for its gender equality, you know. Now, let's talk about annulment and separation. Adultery could be grounds for annulment, which basically meant the church declared the marriage invalid from the start. This was a pretty big deal, because it meant you were no longer legally married in the eyes of the church. However, annulments were often difficult to obtain, especially if powerful families were involved. Separation, on the other hand, was a bit more common. It allowed the couple to live apart without officially ending the marriage. This could be a temporary arrangement, or it could last for years. But remember, even if a couple was separated, they were still technically married in the eyes of the church, which meant they couldn't remarry. And of course, there were the social consequences to consider. Being branded an adulterer could ruin your reputation and make it hard to find work or make friends. Your children could also suffer, facing social stigma and discrimination. The severity of these consequences really depended on the situation. Were powerful families involved? How wealthy were the persons in question? Was there a child in the mix? These factors certainly determined the outcome. The whole thing was messy, complicated, and often unfair, and it just highlights the complexities of marriage and morality in the Middle Ages. While the church preached about the sanctity of marriage, human nature often got in the way, leading to public shaming, harsh punishments, and all sorts of social drama. It's a reminder that even in the most rigid societies, people still found ways to break the rules. Alright, so, divorce in the medieval world sounds pretty final, right? Like locked in, no escape. And to some extent that's kinda true. The church, as we've hammered on, held marriage as pretty much unbreakable. What God has joined, let no one separate, and all that. But hold on a second, because human beings, being human beings, are pretty resourceful when they really want to get out of something. So let's dig into how folks actually, escaped marriage in the Middle Ages. Firstly, let's address the elephant in the room. What about just leaving, desertion? Now this was way more common than any official divorce proceedings, especially amongst the lower classes, the peasants, the laborers. Think about it, life was already tough. If you were stuck in a miserable marriage, maybe with abuse, maybe with just plain incompatibility, and there wasn't much to tie you down, well, walking away was a real option. You change towns, you start working elsewhere, you may change your identity as well. The downside, of course, is you were alone. The problem? The church really frowned on desertion. It was seen as a sin, a violation of your marital vows. But enforcement? That was patchy, to put it kindly. If you were a serf tied to the land, leaving was obviously harder. But if you were a free peasant or a townsperson, you could often just disappear and start over, hopefully far away. And the further you get, the less likely that old life haunts you. It's a gamble. For the higher classes, desertion was less common, but it did happen. The consequences, though, were much bigger. Land, titles, social standing, all that got real messy if you just ran off. And if someone important deserted, the church and the state were far more interested in stepping in. So desertion, a desperate measure, often born of necessity. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't legal, but it existed. Now let's talk about the slightly more official but still kinda sketchy stuff. Informal separations. Remember, formal divorce in the way we think of it now, basically non-existent. But separation, that was a grey area. Sometimes couples would just mutually agree to live apart. This might happen if they were constantly fighting, if they were just deeply unhappy, or if one spouse just really needed to, let's say, focus on their spiritual life, away from the distractions of marriage. Again, the church wasn't thrilled about this. It was still technically breaking your vows, just in a slower, less dramatic way. However, if the separation was peaceful, if it avoided scandal, and especially if it involved one or both spouses donating generously to the church, well, sometimes the church would look the other way, basically as long as they still got their cut. These separations were often informal, based on a private agreement between the couple. They'd divide their property, arrange for separate residences, and try to live as independently as possible, without causing too much of a fuss. Again, this was more common amongst the wealthier classes, who had the resources to maintain separate households. Now here's where it gets really juicy. The legal loopholes. Because, surprise surprise, even the seemingly unbreakable rules of the church had their cracks. And the biggest crack of all was consanguinity. Yes, that's a mouthful. What does it mean, being too closely related to your spouse? See, the church had a complicated system for calculating degrees of kinship. The closer you were related, the more frowned upon the marriage was. And if you were too closely related, the marriage was considered invalid from the start. It could be annulled. Boom, escape route. Now medieval nobles were all intermarried as hell. Family trees were twisty, relationships were complicated. So often, it was possible to find some distant cousin, some shared ancestor, that made you technically too closely related to your spouse, even if you had no idea about it at the time of the marriage. Someone wanting out of the marriage would of course bring that to the attention of the church leaders. Oops, we are related by marriage 6 generations ago. Didn't know the catch. You had to prove it. This meant digging through family records, interviewing relatives, and presenting evidence to a church court. It could be expensive, it could be time-consuming, and there was always a risk the court would say, "Nah, you're fine, get back to being married." But if you did manage to prove consanguinity, you were free. The marriage was declared invalid, and you could go your separate ways, maybe even remarry. Unless, of course, you knew about it beforehand, then you could be in a whole other kind of trouble. But these marriage arrangements happened all the time, so the chances of people knowing was low. Then, there's the catch-all non-consummation. If the marriage wasn't properly consummated, that is, if the couple hadn't had sex, then again, the marriage could be annulled. Now you might think proving this would be tricky, and you're right. But if one spouse was, say, physically incapable of sex, or if they both swore under oath that they hadn't consummated the marriage, and the church court believed them, well, annulment ahoy. This gets tricky, of course, as the church leaders are not going to like it. But again, if this gets proven through legal routes, and they believe that either party in the marriage did not go through the deed as the good book says, well then that would be enough to make this work. Lastly, impotency, or physical inability to procreate, was a real and viable reason to divorce. The reasons for this were as simple as they were blunt. If the couple cannot reproduce and provide heirs, the marriage has failed, its primary duty. Again, it's not pretty, but it's reality. So, medieval marriage? Not quite as unbreakable as the church wanted you to think. Sure, it was difficult to escape, especially if you were poor or if you were important. But with desertion, informal separation, or some clever legal maneuvering, it was often possible to find a way out. The key: resources, persistence, and maybe a little bit of luck. And, if all else fails, some well-placed donations to the church. Hey, nobody said escaping a medieval marriage was easy. Alright, let's dive into the chaotic world of bigamy in the medieval times, illegal unions, and the societal ripple effects they created. It's a bit of a messy topic, so snuggle in. So, you know how the church was super clear about marriage being a sacred, unbreakable bond, right? "Till death do us part" wasn't just a nice saying, it was the bedrock of how they viewed matrimony. This created a bit of a problem when, well, people weren't exactly thrilled with their spouses anymore, or had other interests. Now, we've already talked about some of the dodgier ways folks tried to wriggle out of a marriage through annulment or just plain desertion. But what about those who decided, nah, I'm just going to get another spouse? Enter bigamy. Plain and simple. Marrying someone when you're already married. Obviously, the church hated this, like burning at the stake levels of hatred in some cases, although thankfully that was rare. Bigamy was considered a sin against the sacrament of marriage itself. It undermined the entire foundation of what they were trying to build. Think of it as medieval marital anarchy. But why did people do it? Well, a whole bunch of reasons. Sometimes it was simply about love or lust. Medieval folks weren't immune to falling for someone new, even if they were already hitched. I mean, feelings are gonna feel, and if you were stuck in an arranged marriage with someone you barely knew, the allure of a passionate affair turning into a full-blown second marriage could be tempting. Then there were the pragmatic reasons. Maybe a noble needed an heir desperately, and his current wife just wasn't producing the goods. Or perhaps a merchant wanted to solidify a business alliance with another family, and a quick second marriage seemed like the most efficient route. Sometimes it was also due to abandonment. If a spouse disappeared for years, and it was assumed they were dead, a remarriage may have happened to provide stability. And let's be honest, medieval record-keeping wasn't exactly Fort Knox. It was much easier to get away with this stuff than you might think. Parish records existed, sure, but they weren't always meticulously maintained, and travel between villages was common. It wasn't always easy to verify someone's marital status. Someone could move a few towns over and just get remarried to an unsuspecting person. Easy peasy. So what happened when someone was caught? This is where the social chaos really kicked in. First of all, there was the legal aspect. Bigamy was, unsurprisingly, illegal in most places based on both canon and secular law. Punishments varied depending on the region, the social status of the bigamist, and the specific circumstances. It could range from public shaming, like being paraded through town in a dunce cap, to fines, imprisonment, or even excommunication from the church. Talk about a major social death. But the legal stuff was often the least of their worries. The real consequences were social. Imagine the scandal. The first spouse, the legal one, was suddenly in a terribly awkward position. Were they still considered married? Did they have any claim to their spouse's property? What about their children? And then there was the second spouse, the one who was tricked or willingly participated in the scandal. They had also suddenly found themselves in an illicit and illegal union. Any children from that union were illegitimate, and therefore had almost no rights to inheritance or social standing. Can you imagine the anger and betrayal? Family honor was a huge deal in the Middle Ages, especially among the nobility. Bigamy brought shame not just on the individual, but on their entire family line. It could ruin reputations, damage political alliances, and spark feuds that lasted for generations. The fallout could also extend to the wider community. Think about it. If people couldn't trust the sanctity of marriage, it undermined the whole social order. It created uncertainty about inheritance, property rights, and the legitimacy of children. It's a bit like pulling a thread on a tapestry. suddenly the whole thing starts to unravel. Now, it's important to remember that the impact of bigamy wasn't always the same for men and women. Surprise, surprise, there was definitely a double standard at play. While both men and women could be accused of bigamy, the consequences for women were often far more severe. A bigamous woman was seen as a deceiver, a threat to the social order, and a defiler of the sacred institution of marriage. Men, while certainly punished, were often given a bit more leeway, especially if they were of high social standing. Consider this. Let's say a noble man has a wife who can't give him an heir, so he secretly marries another woman. If he's powerful enough, he might be able to get away with it, perhaps by bribing officials or simply intimidating anyone who tries to challenge him. The first wife might be quietly sidelined, her rights ignored. The second wife would then be celebrated, while the first is outcast. On the other hand, if a noble woman secretly remarried because her husband was infertile or abusive or just plain gone, she would almost certainly face far harsher consequences. She would likely be branded an adulteress, stripped of her property, and potentially even imprisoned or exiled. There were, however, some people who tried to exploit these bigamy rules. Someone may pretend to be married to someone, or the other spouse claimed to be single, to reap the benefits of marriage. It was more common that people lied about this. So, bigamy in the Middle Ages wasn't just about breaking the rules, it was about power, social standing, and the messy reality of human relationships clashing with the rigid expectations of the church and society. It created confusion and uncertainty, leaving a trail of broken hearts, ruined reputations, and illegitimate children in its wake. It's definitely a reminder that behind those fairy tale castles and chivalrous knights, there was a whole lot of drama going on. Alright, settle in folks, because we're about to dive into a truly dark corner of medieval marriage: witchcraft accusations. Yawn. It's a bit of a heavy topic, but important to understanding just how desperate people could get to escape a bad situation back then. So we've already talked about how difficult it was to actually, divorce in the Middle Ages. The church really frowned upon it, seeing marriage as a sacrament, basically unbreakable. Annulments were possible, but hard to get, requiring proof of things like consanguinity, being too closely related, or impotence, and those weren't always easy to prove or convenient. But what if you could find another way? A way that would not only end the marriage, but also, shall we say, remove the unwanted spouse from the picture entirely. Yawn. Enter the witchcraft accusation. Now let's be clear, the belief in witchcraft was very real in the medieval world. People genuinely feared the power of malevolent magic. They believed witches could cause sickness, blight crops, kill livestock, and generally wreak havoc on their lives. And this wasn't just a peasant belief, mind you. Learned scholars and even members of the clergy wrote extensively about witchcraft and its dangers. Malleus Maleficarum. Anyone? Yawn. That scary book. So accusations of witchcraft were serious business, but they were also incredibly easy to manipulate. There wasn't really any hard evidence required, just suspicion, rumor, and perhaps a little bit of incentive for the local community to agree with you. Think of it as medieval cancel culture, but with much, much higher stakes. And this is where the marital escape route comes in. If you wanted out of a marriage and couldn't get an annulment, accusing your spouse of witchcraft could be a shockingly effective, if utterly brutal, solution. Think about it. A husband could claim his wife's been cursing his livestock, or that his business failures were due to her malevolent spells, or even that she was responsible for his own inability to produce heirs. Yawn. That last one was a real killer for some marriages. The accusations flew, fueled by superstition and often pre-existing tensions within the community. Of course, it wasn't always husbands accusing wives. Wives could also accuse their husbands, although it was less common, likely due to the patriarchal nature of medieval society. A woman might accuse her husband of using magic to control her, or of consorting with demons, or of, well, anything that could paint him as a threat to the community. It was just a lot harder to be believed, unfortunately. The process following an accusation was terrifying. The accused, almost always women, would be subjected to interrogation, often involving torture, yawn, sleep deprivation, physical beatings, and psychological manipulation were all common tactics used to extract a confession. And let's be honest, under that kind of pressure, anyone could be made to confess to anything. Even without torture, the social pressure could be immense. Accused witches were often ostracized by their communities, their reputations ruined, their families shamed. The fear of being associated with witchcraft was powerful, and people would often turn against the accused simply to protect themselves. This is why they were very popular. Yawn, so many benefits for a desperate man or woman. And what happened after a confession? Well, that depended on the local authorities. In some cases, the accused might be banished from the community, effectively ending the marriage but leaving them alive, if utterly ruined. But in many cases, the punishment was far more severe. Burning at the stake was a common fate for convicted witches. It was seen as a way to purify the soul and protect the community from further harm. So imagine the situation: you're trapped in a loveless marriage. Yawn, maybe your spouse is abusive, or maybe you just can't stand them anymore. You see no legal way out, so you plant a few seeds of doubt about their behavior. Maybe you tell the neighbors they've been acting strangely, or that their livestock keep dying mysteriously, or that they talk to themselves in the woods at night. Then you subtly guide the suspicion towards witchcraft. You mention that old wives' tale about how witches can curse milk, or that your spouse has always been a bit odd, or that they seem to know things they shouldn't know. Yawn, then you let the rumor mill do its work, and hope that it snowballs into an official accusation. It's a horrifying thought, isn't it? Using the very real fear of witchcraft as a weapon to destroy someone's life and escape a marriage. But it happened. We know it happened, because the historical records are full of such cases. And it's important to remember that these cases weren't just about superstition. They were also about power, control, and the desperate desire to escape a situation that felt unbearable. Yawn. Alright, let's dive into the fascinating world of medieval courts and their role in resolving marital disputes. Now, when we think of medieval times, images of knights, castles, and grand battles often come to mind. But behind all the pomp and circumstance, people were just, well, people. And that means relationships, even marriages, weren't always smooth sailing. When things went south, it was the medieval courts that often stepped in, or at least tried to. So who was actually in these courts? Well, it really depended on the nature of the dispute and the social status of the people involved. For the average peasant, the local manorial court, presided over by the lord of the manor or his steward, was the first port of call. Think of it as small claims court, medieval style. Disputes over dowries, accusations of abuse, or even just general disagreements about marital responsibilities could all end up being aired out in front of the lord and the rest of the community. For the nobility and the wealthier merchant classes, things got a bit more complicated. Their cases often landed in the ecclesiastical courts, which were run by the church. Remember, the church held a massive amount of power and influence in medieval society, and they considered marriage to be a sacrament, a sacred bond. This meant that any serious marital problems, like adultery, bigamy, or even accusations of heresy, fell under their jurisdiction. Now, these weren't exactly the same as modern courtrooms. Forget about fancy gavels and stenographers. The proceedings were often informal, based on local customs, common law, and the church's canon law, which, let's be honest, wasn't always the clearest or most consistent. Evidence could be presented in the form of witness testimony, written documents if there were any, and even trial by ordeal in some of the more, primitive courts. Yeah, you heard me, trial by ordeal. Picture this: having to hold a red-hot iron, and if your hand healed cleanly in a set amount of time, boom, proven innocent. Medieval justice at its finest. So what kind of issues did these courts actually deal with? Well, as you might imagine, infidelity was a big one. Adultery was a serious offense, especially for women. A cheating wife could face public shaming, fines, and even imprisonment. Men, on the other hand, often got off much easier. Double standards. Oh, they were alive and well back then. Then there were disputes over dowries. Remember, a dowry was the property or money that a woman brought to her marriage, and it was often her only form of financial security. If the marriage broke down, or if the husband died, getting that dowry back could be a real battle. Courts were often called upon to mediate these disputes, ensuring that the woman or her family received what was rightfully theirs, or at least what the court thought was rightful. Accusations of domestic abuse, or what we now call domestic abuse, were another common issue. I say what we now call because, let's be real, the medieval understanding of what constituted abuse was, shall we say, different from ours. What we would recognize as physical or emotional abuse was often seen as perfectly acceptable or even necessary marital discipline. That said, there were limits. If a husband was excessively violent, or if he was neglecting his wife's basic needs, she could petition the court for some kind of remedy. This might involve a formal warning to the husband, a separation order, or in extreme cases, even an annulment. But let's be clear, the system was heavily biased in favor of men, and women often faced an uphill battle trying to prove their case. And what about divorce? Well, technically, true divorce, as we understand it today, was pretty much non-existent in the medieval period. The church believed that marriage was a lifelong bond, ordained by God, and therefore indissoluble. However, there were ways to get out of a marriage, or at least to separate from your spouse. One option was annulment. This was a declaration by the church that the marriage had never been valid in the first place. There were various grounds for annulment, such as consanguinity, being too closely related to your spouse, impotence, or if one party had been forced into the marriage against their will. But annulments were expensive, time-consuming, and often required powerful connections. Another option was formal separation. This didn't dissolve the marriage, but it allowed the couple to live apart, often with some kind of financial arrangement in place. Separation was usually granted in cases of adultery, abuse, or irreconcilable differences. However, separated couples were still technically married, and they couldn't remarry unless one of them died. Now, it's important to remember that the effectiveness of these courts varied greatly, depending on the time period, the region, and the social status of the people involved. The system was often corrupt, biased, and slow-moving. Justice wasn't always blind, and money and influence could often sway the outcome of a case. Despite all their flaws, medieval courts played a crucial role in regulating marital relationships. They provided a forum for resolving disputes, enforcing social norms, and protecting the rights of individuals, even if those rights were often limited and unequally applied. Without these courts, medieval society would have been even more chaotic and unjust than it already was. So next time you think about those knights and castles, remember the drama unfolding behind closed doors, the messy relationships, and the courts trying to navigate the complexities of medieval marriage. It's a real reminder that even in the age of chivalry, sometimes love just wasn't enough, and that life, like always, well, found a way. Alright, so we've been talking a lot about how difficult medieval marriages could be, the pressures, the expectations, but sometimes it's easier to really get it when you look at specific examples, right? So let's dive into a few case studies, a few real-life failed marriages, to really hammer home just how messy things could get back then. First up, we have the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine and King Louis VII of France. Now, this wasn't some peasant squabble, this was royalty. Eleanor, powerful duchess in her own right, married Louis to create this massive unified kingdom. But things quickly started to go south. Louis was, well, he was kind of pious, focused on religious devotion, and less so on, say, managing a strong, independent wife. Eleanor, on the other hand, was a vibrant, intelligent woman, used to having her own way. The clash of personalities was immediate. They went on the Second Crusade together, which, whew, what a disaster. Eleanor supposedly found Louis to be a bit ineffective as a military leader, and whispers started, rumors of affairs, particularly with her uncle Raymond of Poitiers in Antioch. It's hard to know exactly what happened there, but tension, thick enough to cut with a sword. They tried for years to have a son, a male heir, but only had daughters. And in medieval society, a lack of a male heir, huge problem. Finally, after 15 years of marriage and a lot of fighting, they got an annulment. The official reason, consanguinity. Turns out they were distantly related, but like everyone, royal family was somehow distantly related to everyone else. So use your imagination. The fallout, huge. Eleanor immediately married Henry Plantagenet, the future King Henry II of England. Suddenly, France had a powerful rival on its doorstep, all thanks to this failed marriage. And later, of course, Eleanor spent years rebelling against Henry, even supporting her sons in their attempts to overthrow him. So yeah, that's the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Louis VII, a powerful union undone by mismatched personalities, political ambition, and a lack of a romantic success. Okay, next, let's look at a case that's a bit lower on the social scale, but still illustrates the challenges. We have the story of Agnes Parston, a lady from a well-to-do English family during the 15th century. Now we know about Agnes because her family left behind a collection of letters, which gives us an absolutely amazing insight into medieval life. Agnes was married off to William Parston. Now William was all right, he was a lawyer, he was ambitious, but their marriage was, well, not exactly a love story, more of a business transaction, a way to secure the family's position. The letters reveal Agnes running the household, managing the estate, dealing with all sorts of problems, from unruly servants to property disputes. And like William seems to have been away a lot, dealing with legal matters. The letters make it pretty clear that there wasn't a ton of emotional intimacy there. Agnes was more concerned with practical matters, making sure things were running smoothly. The letters don't indicate she was unhappy, exactly, just pragmatic. But that in itself makes it a failed marriage. People should want to be around the one they married. And here's the thing, while she may not have been actively looking for a way out, she also wasn't afraid to stand up for herself and her family's interests. William wasn't exactly the most decisive of people, so Agnes ended up making the big decisions. Basically, Agnes was a manager in a male's world. The Parston's life gives insight to the daily lives of high societies, where love was the least important aspect of marriage. Alright, so let's shift gears and look at something a little different. Let's talk about annulments. Now these weren't exactly divorces as we know them. The church believed marriage was a sacrament, practically impossible to dissolve. But annulments were different. They basically declared that the marriage was never valid to begin with. So what kind of stuff would get you an annulment? Well, consanguinity, like with Eleanor of Aquitaine, was one. If you were too closely related, the church might grant an annulment, even if you'd been married for years. Impotence was another. If one spouse couldn't consummate the marriage, that could be grounds for annulment. Lack of consent was another. This was trickier. If someone was forced into a marriage, they could potentially get an annulment, but proving it was of course difficult. And then there were accusations of witchcraft. Now this was a particularly nasty way to get out of a marriage. Accuse your spouse of being a witch, and well, that could lead to some unpleasantness. But if you could convince the authorities, it could also lead to the marriage being dissolved, and often your spouse being executed. These case studies show just how complicated medieval marriages could be, the challenges of power, the pressure of expectations, and the limited options for escape. And honestly, it makes you appreciate the relatively easier ways we have to end a marriage today, Alright, so we've followed medieval couples through thick and thin, from the royal courts to the humble peasant's cottage. We've seen how marriage was simultaneously a sacrament, a political tool, an economic contract, and, well, sometimes a complete and utter disaster. So what can we conclude from all of this? The story of marital dissolution in the Middle Ages isn't simple. It's a swirling vortex of contradictions, fueled by the clash between the Church's unwavering ideals and the messy realities of human life. The Church, remember, preached indissolubility. Marriage, a sacred union blessed by God, was meant to last until death did them part. No exceptions, ideally. But as we've seen, exceptions, or at least loopholes, were creatively explored. Annulments, for instance, provided a backdoor out of marriages deemed invalid from the start. Consanguinity, being too closely related, was a popular go-to. Did you know that medieval genealogies could be flexible, especially when a king needed a new wife to secure an heir? It's amazing how easily people discovered long-lost family ties when a throne was at stake. It was like a really messy medieval version of Who Do You Think You Are? Except, instead of a tearful reunion, it ended in a royal divorce. And then there were the accusations of non-consummation. Convincing the Church that your marriage has never ever been consummated was a thing. You had to prove it. The Church would send people to poke and prod and do all sorts of things to see if your hymen was still intact. A woman would be forced to display her breasts to a jury of women as part of an appeal to leave her marriage. And what about when the Church said no? Did that mean unhappy couples were simply stuck together? Not necessarily. While formal divorce was off the table, separation, either formal or informal, was a very real option. Sometimes it was a practical solution to escape abuse, infidelity, or just plain incompatibility. A noble woman might retreat to a convent, effectively ending the marriage even if the Church didn't officially sanction it. A peasant might simply pack their bags and vanish. Of course, such actions came with risks, social stigma, financial hardship, legal repercussions, but for some the price of freedom was worth paying. The legal landscape was just as complex. Manorial courts, ecclesiastical courts, royal courts, each had its own jurisdiction and its own set of rules. Navigating this system was a challenge, especially for women, who often lacked the legal standing to represent themselves effectively. We saw how inheritance disputes could tear families apart, how child custody rights were practically non-existent for mothers, and how domestic violence was often swept under the rug, or rather, the tapestry. And the social expectations. Oh, the expectations. Men and women were expected to fulfill very different roles within the marriage. Women were expected to be dutiful, obedient, fertile, and manage the household. Men were expected to provide, protect, and maintain their family's honor and status. When those expectations weren't met, whether due to infertility, infidelity, or simply a clash of personalities, the cracks in the marital foundation began to show. Think about the double standards surrounding infidelity. For men, a discreet affair might be tolerated, even expected in some circles, especially amongst royalty. For women, infidelity was a scandalous betrayal, punishable by public shaming, exile, or even death. This inequality highlights the patriarchal nature of medieval society and the limited agency women had within marriage. And then there were the unconventional solutions. Accusations of witchcraft could be weaponized to dissolve unwanted marriages. Bigamy, while illegal, was sometimes practiced, particularly by men seeking heirs or simply a more compatible partner. Desertion and abandonment left spouses in legal and social limbo, struggling to survive without the support of their partner. People were really desperate to get out of their marriage. Ultimately, the story of medieval marital dissolution is a testament to human ingenuity and human fallibility. People found ways to navigate, circumvent, or outright defy the Church's rigid rules, often with significant personal cost. It reveals the tension between the idealized vision of marriage and the messy realities of love, lust, power, and survival. It's a reminder that even in the Middle Ages, relationships were complicated, and that people, when pushed, will find ways to seek happiness, even if it means challenging the established order. So next time you think of medieval marriage as some fairy tale romance, remember the annulments, the separations, the accusations, the desertions, and the sheer unadulterated drama. It wasn't all knights in shining armor and damsels in distress. It was a complex, often contradictory, and always fascinating reflection of human nature in a world where even the most sacred vows could be creatively interpreted. And that's something, isn't it?